Well, let me open this session. We're a little bit behind, so I'm not going to give the 15-minute speech I was hoping to give. Instead, I'll just introduce, make an apology, then introduce the speakers. So this is all about economic security studies, which I know nothing about, which is, I guess, why I was asked to chair this session. So we go straight on to Joris TEER, who's the research analyst for economic security and technology at the European Union Institute for Security Studies.
Thank you so much. Let me see. Yeah, that works. Great to be here today. I have a different topic, but a topic that I think expands on a lot that has been discussed already today, and that is China's increasing dominance over low or no economic value added, but strategically indispensable products. It's something that Richard already alluded to, that in a happy and globalized world, we may not care about who takes the rare earths out of the ground and who refines them. Indeed, we even prefer to not have to do that ourselves. Because with rare earth refining, there's radioactive waste. With mining, there's a lot of strain on the people that do that. There can be difficulties in terms of the environment around it if you don't do it the right way. But principally, now that great power competition has returned, I think we have to deal with two sorts of problems. And the first is that control over these critical economic inputs might be misused if countries become unwilling to supply you whatever you need to have your end products, and not just your end product, but really your critical state functions, your healthcare sectors, your militaries, etc. That's the first problem set. And the second problem set is countries may become unable to supply. And this is, of course, something that we've seen in war zones, where if there's too much concentration of a specific good, however good your relations with those countries are, in terms of great power competition, there's an increasing risk of some sort of systemic conflict. I'm thinking of Eastern Europe, and I'm thinking of East Asia, of course, that may make these critical inputs inaccessible as well. Well, what are critical inputs? These are these horizontal layers of the global economy without which we cannot do. Critical raw materials are really the skeleton of the global economy. Pull that out, you don't have your pacemakers, your drones, your fighter jets, your wind turbines. It's very difficult to think of anything that still works. And well, if those are the skeleton of the global economy, then the semiconductors are the central nervous system. Pull the semiconductors out and the entire list of things that I just mentioned also doesn't work. And if that's the central nervous system, the chemicals are the connective tissues. Without the chemicals, none of this can be produced too. So whereas we sort of all applied the H&M model, you design at home and you manufacture somewhere else and you can keep the value added. That worked well in the globalized world, but now with military threats around Taiwan and with the increasing weaponization by China of these key value chains, we suddenly have to care again about strategic value added and not just economic value added. And by the way, this works in the semiconductor industry as well. If you look at where the revenue is, where the money is made in the semiconductor value chain, it's about 45 to 50% even in the end goes to the design firms, which are of course majority US based, and the more arduous production stages on which we all rely, because if you don't have access to the production, you don't have the final product and you can't put the semiconductor in all our vital sectors. So two great threats to that I want to zoom into today. One is the risk of conflict, military conflict in East Asia, which might make a lot of countries unable to supply and make China even more unwilling to supply some critical goods. And if I look at 6 powerful trends that we discerned in a risk analysis scenario paper that we did for the Dutch Parliament, I think there's reason for concern. The first trend, and probably the most important trend, is the rapid expansion of China's People's Liberation Army, including the Navy and the missile forces, etc. In 1990, Taiwan and China still spent the same on defense. In 2021 already, China spent 21 times more. which of course underlines the importance of American willingness and deterrence and continued involvement in East Asia to make up that gap. And if you then look at what China's money bought it, I think we can distinguish two phases. There was first the phase of blunting, of building the specific weapons necessary to cost effectively undo US dominance in the region. So I'm thinking of long-range missiles, I'm thinking of mines, I'm thinking of submarines, basically anything that would make it too dangerous for the Americans to intervene with their highly expensive big naval platforms like aircraft carriers close to China's shore. And then, of course, there's now a second phase, and that's the rapid expansion of the Navy itself. Supported by China's unprecedented shipbuilding capacity. China does 50% of all the shipbuilding worldwide. The US, the UK, Germany and France combined less than 1%. Well, that is a problem if you're in a naval competition. I come from the Netherlands, we still do a lot of ship design. But of course, we build our ships somewhere else, in China, but also in Japan and in Korea. Well, if you're in a naval competition, and if you notice that during the Second World War, the US started off with 700 ships in 1939, and then won the war in the end with 4,500 plus ships, you understand why it's important to not just design something, but to have production capacity. And to have production capacity, you need the guaranteed access to low economic value added, but strategically indispensable inputs. There's another couple of factors why I think the chances of conflict are increasingly likely. I won't run through all of them. But one, of course, is Chinese frustration that its gray zone activities, the cutting of cables, cyber campaigns, disinformation campaigns, are not getting Taiwan closer to China. They're actually pushing Taiwan away. Only 7% of Taiwanese want either, quote unquote, reunification now or at some point in the future. So we see a structural increase in the risk. Then the question is, what's at stake? What's at stake is, depending on whose estimates you look at, 75 to 80% of all semiconductors globally being produced in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China combined. Not just the front-end manufacturing, the less lucrative back-end manufacturing, it's about the same number. But that's not the only value that's being created here in this region. Out of the critical raw materials, out of the 34 that the European Union deems critical, and we deem something critical if it's essential for our vital sectors. Again, think of defense, et cetera, 19 out of those 34 are either majority mined or refined in China. We see that with the ongoing deindustrialization of Germany, where does all this chemical production capacity go to? Really China again. What happens if you have a conflict? Well, it of course depends a bit on the degree. What is the conflict? Is the conflict a downright invasion? Is the conflict a blockade of Taiwan? Is the conflict a quarantine? But what happens is there's two dynamics anyway, and we're just talking about a difference in scale between those three examples. The first dynamic is war-related disruption. The inability to continue supply because of certain measures, and of course in the invasion scenario, especially with a US counter-intervention, I mean, you're looking at a whole region that glows up from basically the southwest coast of Japan to Korea, to all of Taiwan, to the South China Sea where the artificial islands are, where trade will be very much impossible. 95% plus of all Taiwan's energy comes from abroad. If the energy can't go into the TSMC fabs, the TSMC fabs don't produce the semiconductors, they can't go to back-end manufacturing, and they can't be shipped out via air to any of our end industries. At the same time, the Chinese critical raw materials that you need for production can't go to the chemical firms in Japan that then need to make the wafer for this production. So the whole thing slows to a halt. You're pulling out the skeleton, you're pulling out the semiconductors, you can't have a rearmament, you can't have a healthcare sector, you can't have digitalization, you can't have the energy transition. So that's on the inability to supply. And this, of course, the invasion scenario. There's smaller but still very significant effects in the blockade scenario. Why? Taiwan makes about 18 to 20% of all semiconductors globally. But these are not face masks. You can't just get a face mask for somewhere else. You can't just get the Japanese semiconductor and say this is now a Taiwanese semiconductor. They are in different ranges, in different technological qualities. And if we look at something like a vital end product like the Joint Strike Fighter, that we in Europe need to deter the Russians, and that throughout East Asia we need to deter the Chinese, there's such a huge range of semiconductors in there. There's highly advanced semiconductors for the smarter stuff. There's also dumb semiconductors in there. There's memory chips in there. Pull out the inputs from either Japan or Korea or Japan, and especially from Taiwan, and you don't have your end product. So even with that blockade, the war-related disruption is real because of the effect that you'll have. But it's not just that, of course, because if great power competition continues, and I think it will continue. It has a different phase under the second Trump administration, but it will continue. There's also China escalating its efforts to becoming unwilling to supply. And we've already seen quite a lot of that this year, of course, with the critical raw material curbs that China very creatively imposed to get all sorts of concessions in other areas as well. But trade in this grinds to a halt. Because if the Americans are still of the mindset that they want to deter a conflict, or if they're engaged in a conflict, they want to fight it, the first thing that's going to happen is massive pressure, not just on US industry, but also European industry and Japanese industry, to no longer supply China with anything, basically. All the technological inputs they need. Well, go to my own home country, the Netherlands. We're the producers of the main systems that produce the chips. 90% of all chips globally go through a ASML semiconductor manufacturing lithography system. The first phone call is to that company to say, you halt your servicing and supply right now because we're killing semiconductor production in China. Because we're going into a sanction spiral, because now the stakes are really, really high. And this is especially the case in an invasion scenarios, of course, in a blockade scenario and a quarantine scenario. It might be a little bit less, but still the logic is there. After which China starts hoarding, no critical raw materials at all leave the country anymore for two reasons. One, you don't want to enable the ongoing fighting power of your rival, of your adversary in this case. And two, there's hoarding, because you're moving into a war economy, and with the example I gave of the Second World War in the US, you want to be able to move from 700 chips to 4,000 chips, or whatever is the equivalent of that today. So a lot hinges on this region, and if you get the standstill, yeah, we're really far removed from having any sort of critical state functions for the long term. Because even the pacemakers and the MRI technologies and everything that we do have, at some point you'll need the spare parts because things are going to run down. And those depend on the critical raw materials, the semiconductors, the chemicals, etc., that come from this region. That is largely, by and large, the problem of being unable to supply if you get a conflict. But of course, we've seen very creative use this year on China's part of becoming unwilling to supply. And the pain of becoming unwilling to supply, the pain of pulling out a key building block out of the other party's industrial production, by and large, by itself is already very large. If we look at the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, their latest survey, they say that the majority of their members have been affected by Chinese export controls this year. If you delve into that a bit more, it's about 40% that says we already have or we will experience significant supply chain issues or even production disruptions or stoppages by a combination of China's current export controls and if the suspension of the 9 October controls ends. And this is before we've entered any military conflict scenarios. I mean, that is not being willing to supply anymore. And of course, the Chinese, they focus on the military sector especially hard, because de facto, the ban on military end use for all of these critical minerals is still in place. So if you're Lockheed Martin and you're trying to get permanent magnets and you say, well, I really need these permanent magnets because I want to build fighter jets, because we have defense industrial issues and we really need to deter Russia and Europe and we really need to deter China and East Asia, well, that's rejected. It's not just that. Component producers, let's say of gallium arsenide wafers in Europe, and these wafers are used to make the wireless semiconductors that are in all our guided ammunitions. If you fill in, I make these wafers, my final client is Lockheed Martin because we want the fighter jet, because we want to maintain deterrence in East Asia and in Europe. There's also not that. But then there's, of course, the wager. You can also not fill it out with the risk that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce starts digging, and the next time they say, well, you didn't fill it out properly last time, across the board ban, we don't deal with you anymore. So, I mean, there's that first problem. There's already the pulling out of the building blocks. But China does this very cleverly. It's not just pulling out building blocks, it's using this as well to glean commercially and militarily sensitive information. You're not just going to say in your questionnaire, are you going to supply Lockheed Martin? No, you're going to say, who are the most important firms that you supply to in general? We want to see how the defense industrial system of the other party is based on. And this, of course, comes at the same time as we've already seen a huge uptick in Chinese intrusions in critical infrastructure in the West, including in defense companies. But it's not just that. It's wanting to see pictures of production facilities, including of drone motors. We really need to see those pictures because otherwise we can't decide whether it's military end use and you don't get your permanent magnets. It's about wanting to know quantities that in the end can decide, okay, how much gallium is there in that gallium arsenide wafer? And if you have the product recipe and at the same time you think of the indigenization campaign in China, well, having the product recipe is of relevance, of course. So it's really in addition to sort of pulling the rug from underneath our defense industries, it's really a spyglass as well that can give you advantages. But it's not just that, it's a crowbar. When this started over the summer and when we Europeans were quite surprised saying, well, you had the whole tariff thing with Trump and he cut you off from semiconductors. Why are you cutting supply of rare earths and all of these other materials to us? What is our involvement in this? We didn't get an answer to our question, but we did get demands. And the demands are, well, why don't you remove your import duties on electric vehicles? And why don't you remove your local content requirements on medical equipment? Even though the Chinese themselves have a goal in 2030 of 95% domestically produced high-end medical systems, and in 87% of cases discriminate against foreign suppliers. Outcome of a European Commission research. So the protective measures that we put in place are very modest versions of something that the Chinese are doing all along. But you see still that this is kind of used as a crowbar. You stick it in, and in terms of disrupting a lot of production and undermining rearmament in Europe and the required defense expansion of the defense industrial base in the United States, you're also trying to get concessions. How does this relate to the Taiwan story? It's not just anymore deterrence about the balance of forces and the balance of power in the region. That's, of course, very important. And if the Chinese People's Liberation Army thinks it can't cross the Taiwan Strait without having to face exceptionally high costs, especially because of a US commitment and a Japanese commitment by extension to defend that, that's already a high cost by itself. But China now has many buttons to push. Because in the lead up to a time when the stakes are even higher, for instance, over the future of Taiwan, China can now say, well, we drip-feeded critical raw materials so far. Now we're cutting you off entirely until you give us the concessions that we want and you allow us to do the customs checks around Taiwan with the quarantine measures that we want to take. Well, okay, then we say, okay, we're going to onshore the critical raw materials, but then you get into the problem that Richard outlined. It's not just the critical raw materials, it's over 30% of all gross manufacturing globally, going up to 45% in 2030 if we have to believe a UN report on this. So we might have the critical raw materials. The lithium batteries are already under export controls in China. They've only been postponed by 12 months. So let's say we have all the materials, but we don't master the battery manufacturing yet. Well, then that's the next button to push. And the Nexperia saga, the Dutch headquarter chip manufacturer, shows that when you have 70% of your back-end manufacturing of chips in China, China can impose export controls on that. So the geo-economic escalation ladder China kind of owns, or is at least a lot more adept at playing the game. Well, we have tons of recommendations on how to deal with the critical raw material issue and the semiconductor issue that I won't bore you with today, but I'd be happy to share our research on that. But I'd really like to get into a second issue, because I think rightfully critical raw materials were a big focus of the Tokyo Economic Security Forum yesterday and often alluded to here as well. But we can't just do the de-risking. We need to do it for these key building blocks. And if we're going to do that, we need to do it as well with demand-side measures that are going to target the entire over-concentration of production in China, including joint public procurement standards, tariffs, etc. But especially very importantly, we need to re-establish economic deterrence. We need to show the Chinese that if you pull out key building blocks on our side, that the Japanese have the well, I forgot the name of that the Dutch have the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, that the Koreans have a lot of the high-end memory chips still, that the Japanese have this component as well that's essential within the lithography manufacturing equipment, without you can't produce semiconductors, that the United States has a lot of the related software. We need to be able to make a credible threat. And in that way, that's the only way in which you're going to present being coerced at all. And this is definitely a test for us Europeans as well, because whereas the US and China both have these escalation measures in place, we kind of sent Ursula von der Leyen with a knife into a gunfight twice this summer because she can't make related threats. And then industry can tell me we're all mutually dependent, so nobody will be coerced. Well, my answer is we are all mutually dependent, and we were coerced very actively so over the summer. The missing link is we can't make a credible threat on the basis of the choke points that we hold. And preferably, you would do something like that with allies because it's much more convincing and you're also much more well protected. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go straight on to the discussion. Who's Alex Bristow from Cyber Technology and Security Program, Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Adelaide. In
Canberra.
Canberra.
Yeah, an even smaller city than Adelaide. Thanks very much. I'm conscious that it's the end of the day, so I'll make sure I don't go over time. I might try to be a little bit quicker than time, just because we are running a little late, I think. Thank you for those fantastic presentations. Very different, but there was obviously a common theme of China. So I'm being ASPI, with our reputation for being hard on China. I'll keep on focus. So I think maybe Ito Sensei, if I can start with you, I think a really thought-provoking presentation. There are a few reference points in your the reports that you looked at where, to be shameless, I would say that ASPI has some research you might want to add to your bibliography. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Samantha Hoffman's work at ASPI, Engineering Global Consent, Mapping the Tech Giants, Truth and Reality with Chinese Characteristics. What those data-rich studies, I think, have shown is that AI can't be sort of extricated from this huge propaganda machine that China has, which is about scraping data from every available means possible, from smart cities, from the Internet of Things, everything that we do in our daily lives. They can draw data potentially from that, and then feed that back into the propaganda mechanisms. It could also be used for other types of hostile interventions in our daily life. In a crisis or a conflict, of course, some of this data could be used to do acts of sabotage and those sorts of things. Just on the shameless, to use the Australian verb spruik, which means to promote, the shameless spruiking of ASPI, I would also say it's worth looking at our critical technology tracker, which hopefully is a product which is familiar to some people here, because I would slightly take issue perhaps with our sense of assurance that we're ahead in the AI race at the moment. So I think you cited the Stanford Index, which would show that the US still has the lead on some of these LLM models. and AI generally, if I've understood it correctly. What the Critical Technology Tracker does is it looks at current research. So it's not necessarily applications that you can go and use today, but it should be a good indication of what's coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And on almost every area of AI, if you break it down to the composite technologies, China is ahead by some way. Actually, the only one, I was just checking the data, the only one where US institutions, and it's Google, is still ahead, is actually on I think, natural language models. So obviously, LLMs would feed into that. So, we have some advantages still, but the time series data in the Critical Technology Tracker would show that we're going to lose that advantage very soon. So it's worse than we think, I think, is the key point I would make there. So thank you for the presentation, Mr. TEER, on Taiwan. There was a lot there, but I would maybe sort of focus in less on the invasion, I think as you did, less on the invasion scenarios and more on the coercive scenarios that would force Taiwan into some sort of accommodation with Beijing that it doesn't want to do. Look, there, I think we're already in a conflict. It's not a hypothetical. I mean, I think the types of pressure that's being applied to Taiwan to subvert its sovereignty and to destroy its connections to the rest of the world are already making it a less viable self-governing entity. I would personally say it is already a state in everything but name. But on some of the scenarios that could apply short of invasion, ASPI's done a project called Pressure Points. I do have it with me, but I won't hold it up. And that was based on some in-depth research in Taiwan in December last year. Well, there's conversations with the defence community in Australia and some tabletop exercises. And this subversion, I think, is the one that the Taiwanese people we spoke to last year seem to be particularly worried about. So there'd be a massive disinformation campaign to sort of disinform the rest of the world as well as Taiwanese society. And then some of those fracture points within Taiwan, it's failing my colours, it's the green and the blue, isn't it, between the two, the DPP and the Kuomintang. You're trying to exploit some of those pressure points for acts of sabotage and things. So please do have a look at pressure points and let me know if you think it's adding anything to the debate. You mentioned economic deterrence. I think that's a good way of looking at it. One of the things we picked up in Taiwan was this sense that actually Taiwan wouldn't allow Beijing to determine the tempo of a serious crisis like a blockade. That actually, if Taiwan believes it's in a critical phase of pressure from, a sort of a terminal phase of pressure from Beijing, that Beijing is actually sort of ramping up to take some sort of control over the island, even if it's not by invasion, then Taiwan's contingency plans would involve diverting power and water into national resilience measures, which would actually require proactively shutting down semiconductor manufacturing. And not everybody would admit this openly, but certainly one of the things we heard from a few sources in Taiwan was that that's not just actually for the national resilience. It's also because they want to globalize the problem early. They don't want Beijing to choose when our smartphone supply chains collapse. Actually, if Taiwan can play a role in that, but earlier than Beijing would choose to, that will actually get global attention and globalize the issue. So I think that is kind of a form of economic deterrence. And obviously there's measures to move some of the semiconductor manufacturing out of Taiwan from TSMC. I think they're going to make sure that they have the critical capabilities retained in Taiwan, that they maintain that economic deterrence. I'm going to just say my final remarks will just be on Australia as an interesting case study. If we were looking at economic forms of coercion, so I think that would be one of the scenarios that obviously that would be applied to try to get Taiwan to do Beijing's bidding. Australia sometimes self-models and is seen by the rest of the world as having successfully resisted economic pressure, particularly between 2000 and 2022. The statistics that the Australian government will use will say that there was about 20 billion of trade measures that were inflicted by Beijing, 20 million Australian dollars of trade measures that were inflicted by Beijing on on Australia, but about 16 billion of that was mitigated by finding alternative markets. Some of those markets, like Vietnam, were taking coal from Australia, which was actually re-exported to China. I don't think Australia minded, actually. Look, and I think it's an important case study, but I think I'm not sure we're taking the right lessons from it. I'm not sure it shows that you can resist trade pressure and Beijing will back off, which is sometimes how it's talked about in Canberra. I think what the lesson that Beijing will take from it is if it does it again, it will make sure it absolutely cripples Australia. So what it couldn't do is it couldn't cut off iron ore supplies. Iron ore imports from Australia, it still needed those. Iron ore is the most valuable export that Australia has Australia has, full stop. And actually its value went up during the trade coercion measures. So in terms of sort of balance of payments, Australia was still doing pretty well. Its terms of trade improved. Look, I think they will have stockpiles and alternative sources of supply like Brazil that if they choose to persecute Australia again, they'll cut off iron ore. And I think that's an interesting model for others to look at. The most significant factor that mitigated pressure on Australia's economy was the existence of an open trading system. To a degree, the government took a role in that it was able to sort of speak to partners and say, well, can you buy a little bit more of our wine and stuff? But the effects of that were probably very marginal. The international trading system that was still functioning in the background was the means for alternative sources of supply and demand to emerge. I guess when we talk about decoupling, we talk about economic security. One form of economic security, plausibly, is the functioning of an international trading system. So that's kind of difficult to reconcile with some of the proposals that have probably come out over the discussions this week. Do I have a minute, or have I've overspoken probably already?
No, I think you still got 53 seconds.
53 seconds. Oh, I certainly didn't go too
Plenty
far.
of time for an Australian.
All right, last Australian reference, why not? Another report we've done here, which is funded by the Australian Department of Defence, looked at the institutional responses if there were a Taiwan crisis. And look, the interesting things was, so we went around all the country, spoke to business leaders, university leaders, etc. The banks have done a lot of due diligence on the Taiwan contingency. They can actually de-risk their portfolios, or they think they can. Business, very mixed bag. Some businesses with high levels of exposure have looked at it, many haven't. Government, bad, don't really understand the issue. Terrible once you get into federal systems like Australia and the United States and territories. Universities, the worst of the lot. They actually think they know what they're going to do, and they've got absolutely no clue.
Thank you very much for that. So I think it's probably best if we just turn immediately to the authors to answer the questions that you posed. I have my own questions, but I think I'll leave it to the experts to talk with the experts. So why don't you start out, Ito-san?
All right, thank you so much. Regarding China's role as a tech giants, it's also constrained the activity of the Chinese company outside. So of course, it's bringing them the kind of the feedback mechanism that the authority can provide a data set. Then the platform company enjoys such kind of input. Then innovate, at least domestically. But it's hard to reaching out outside, especially the G7 nation under this the setting. So, but again there's an implication, especially global South implication. So we found recently those high offshore from the global South nation pay a visit to Beijing. Then they will typically spend another 1 day in somewhere local cities. Then sometimes spending a day in the Hangzhou, even spending 1 day in Shenzhen. So looking around the kind of the new tech, the companies and solutions. I'm a little bit worried about such kind of the global implication, global South implication of the kind of the spillover of the China's the digital governance. So that's one point. Then The second point is that you ask about is China actually ahead of the the many tech field? Perhaps it's correct. So then the reason why basically is that there are tremendous amount of the younger generation who specialize on the engineering. Then it's such a talented guys. I mean, the younger generation. I have some co-workers that in Beijing or Shanghai that they're so well skilled, wonderful. I mean, skill set they have. Them, yeah. What if the target is clear that the system work, So let me give a little bit short remarks on what the Professor Baldwin talked about. It's not possible to decouple. That's also, I believe, that true for China as well. Given the recent high level meeting in Beijing, that it clearly shows that the production is too strong. Consumption is too weak in China. They need the demand outside. This is it's a very much strong. I think the long existing problem for China for decades. Then it's not really. They are addressed by the short-term government expense. So given the real estate bubble. The collapse, already in China. So I think it is also true from China side, Beijing side, that probably the couple will bring the great burden to the overall macroeconomic prospect. So that's the third remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Joris, you want to pick up some things?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I think the Australia case is intriguing because it's sort of an import ban on the Chinese side. But what I think we've learned with the critical raw materials saga this year is that pulling out critical economic inputs out of the industrial base of the other party trumps import denial or tariffs. Because what the Trump administration tried is levy these incredibly high tariffs on China from the logic China is selling a lot more to us than we're to them, so we'll hurt them more. And then the Chinese said, good luck producing anything without the rare earths. And the irony is that whereas the China hawks sort of in seclusion continue to impose new and new tech controls on China, running it by Trump's desk, and initially he signs them. Because there was that and the tariffs, Trump suddenly has to deal with car companies coming to his office that say, listen, without the permanent magnets, we can't produce. And if we can't produce, we'll have to offshore engine production and the entire car production to China, because we can still export the sub-manufacturer or the end product, which in the end reversed not just the tariff policy back to 47%, crazily a lower amount than India is charged with. Not just that, but it changed the entire course of the tech competition that was about rhetorically small yard high fence, but a yard that kept getting wider and wider, and now the yard is getting smaller and smaller. So I think we've really seen the effectiveness of a different kind of economic coercion, namely one on the supply of critical economic inputs, as opposed to one of punishing via market access, via tariffs. And this is why I'm worried that people are indeed, as you say, drawing the wrong lesson from the Australia or the Lithuania example, while they should be drawing the right lesson from this year, even when China is just drip feeding us critical raw materials. The disruption is really quite significant. Looking forward and looking a bit more towards solutions, I think, and this is to quote a phrase that Stefan used earlier today, we have to be very explicit about the cost of doing nothing. If we have workshops with semiconductor companies in Europe, those who compete directly with the Chinese on legacy segments, quite a few of them speak in terms of we're in a let us die in peace scenario. Xi Jinping has decided already in 2015 that without a strong and big and advanced manufacturing base, and these are his words, there can't be no country, no nation. In 2020, he said that it should be Chinese policy to deepen the international production chains dependence on China, because this serves as a deterrent to countries who would otherwise cut off supply to China. So it's not just building a self-reliant industrial fortress anymore. Now, on top of that, explicitly, our dependencies need to be deepened. And we see a whole range of measures in that direction, banning the exports of key rare earth production machinery that we need. Also informally, even though the formal ban is now postponed for 12 months. And you see in more recent speeches the constant emphasis on the normal operation of the economy in China needs to be maintained at a time of extreme situations. And if they then ask Chinese academics, what are extreme situations? Well, this has to do with the Taiwan issue, the risk of conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So we might think that China cannot decouple, but it's definitely trying. And it's definitely trying across all of these sectors, and the materials that it can't mine domestically, it will create huge stockpiles for, which it is already doing. And then the question becomes, how do you counter that? Because from this, of course, come a whole range of measures, including subsidies, local content requirements, but also very valid and smart measures, building the port infrastructure, building the enormous renewable energy build-out, but also the enormous nuclear power build-out and the enormous coal-fired power plant build-out, all at the same time to build that sort of self-reliant fortress with a self-reliant energy base underneath it in a country that only spends 10% of its GDP on social services and welfare, whereas we in Europe at 30% and in the US at 20%. So that's what we're competing with. The logic is very clear. If you don't do anything, only more manufacturing power is going to come to China. If you do what we're currently doing, which is necessary, the plugging holes, the looking at the individual materials, and we're going to subsidize here, and we're going to grant here, and we're going to take a state equity requirement here. Yes, we'll get a lot of the stuff, but not all of the stuff we need. So what we need really is allied skill. We need to leverage that 60% plus of the global economy that still the G7 and its closest partners are, to make sure that our demand starts creating supply for all of these critical layers in countries that we trust. And this is where the Trump administration is both productive and unproductive. It's productive in its disruption, because if the Biden administration came to Europe, we say, well, we'd like to stick to the WTO, so we're not going to do the tariff wall around China. Trump is doing all sorts of tariff walls, but around everyone. And it's also hurting themselves. So once we can synergize there again, I think we'll work towards a real solution. Thank you.
Thank you. It wasn't the cheeriest way to end the day, but I think we've had some very important insights revealed and discussed. So I'm going to shut it down right here. We're already about 10 minutes late. And so I'll move straight to the closing remarks, who I think is Yaz Todo is going to come up. So thank you very much.